Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air on East 46th Street on the evening of December 16, 1985, was cold and festive. Christmas lights glittered on the facades of Midtown Manhattan, reflecting in the glossy paint of luxury sedans pulling up to the curb. Outside Sparks Steakhouse, the scent of sizzling beef and expensive cigars mingled with the crisp winter chill. It was a scene of routine opulence, a living portrait of New York's relentless ambition, of men in tailored suits arriving for dinner, their power as much a part of their attire as their silk ties. One of these men was Paul Castellano, the reputed boss of bosses, the head of the Gambino crime family. He was 70 years old, a grandfather with a regal bearing and a quiet voice. He saw himself not as a thug, but as a chairman of the board, a businessman who just happened to preside over the largest and most profitable criminal organization in America. As his black Lincoln sedan slid to a stop, the quiet rhythm of the evening was shattered. 3, perhaps 4 men in identical long beige trench coats and black Russian-style fur hats converged on the car. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose. Like specters rising from the concrete, they did not shout. They did not hesitate. There was a horrifying efficiency to their movements. The night erupted in a staccato of gunfire, a brutal and deafening percussion that tore through the fabric of the city's insulated calm. Glass spider-webbed and exploded. Paul Castellano, the man they called Big Paul, was struck at least 6 times in the head and torso before he could even fully exit his vehicle. His newly appointed driver and underboss, Thomas Bellotti, a bulldog of a man who was fiercely loyal to his boss, met the same fate as he emerged from the driver's side, gun drawn but a fatal second too late. Within moments, it was over. The assassins melted back into the shadows of the city, leaving behind a tableau of shocking public violence. This was not just a murder. It was a public execution, a coup d'etat carried out on one of Manhattan's busiest streets during rush hour. It was a message, written in blood on the pavement, that a new era had begun. Just minutes later, across the street, John Gotti, the ambitious and charismatic capo who had orchestrated the hit, watched from his own car as his loyalist, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, confirmed the kill. But while one king was violently deposed to make way for another, a far greater threat was looming, one that didn't carry a gun. This threat carried a briefcase. It was a sprawling, audacious legal assault being mounted by the United States government, an attack aimed not at a single soldier or even a single king, but at the very institution of the Mafia itself, at its ruling council, the shadowy board of directors known as the Commission. The assassination of Paul Castellano was a brutal crime, but it was merely a symptom. The disease was the organization itself, and a small team of federal prosecutors believed they had finally found the cure. Tonight on Anatomy of Crime, we will not be dissecting a single murder weapon or the psychological profile of one killer. We will dissect the anatomy of a takedown. We are examining the intricate legal machinery and the immense political will required to dismantle a criminal empire that had operated above the law for over 50 years. We will explore the weaponization of a single powerful statute, the RICO Act, and how a young, ferociously ambitious prosecutor named Rudolph Giuliani aimed it not like a scalpel to cut out a tumor, but like a guillotine to sever the head from the body of organized crime in America, once and for all. This is the story of the Mafia Commission Trial, the case that broke the back of the mob. To understand the monumental nature of the Commission Trial, one must first appreciate the entity it sought to destroy. By the early 1980s, La Cosa Nostra, the American Mafia, was not merely a collection of street gangs. It was a parallel government, a corporate conglomerate of crime with its own laws, its own enforcement, and its own board of directors. In New York City, its power was consolidated into the infamous 5 families. The Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families were titans of industry, the dark industry of illegality. Their tentacles reached into the very bones of the city, from the docks of the waterfront to the glittering garment district, and most critically, into the concrete foundations of every new skyscraper piercing the skyline. This sophisticated structure was born from the bloody chaos of the 1920s and early 30s. The Castellamarese War, a brutal internal conflict, had left the old guard of Sicilian mustache Petes dead and a new generation of Americanized mobsters in their place. At the head of this new wave was Charles Lucky Luciano. He was a visionary, a criminal prodigy who understood that endless war was bad for business. In 1931, he created the Commission. It was the Mafia's United Nations and its Supreme Court, rolled into one, a national governing body comprised of the bosses of the most powerful families. Its purpose was to regulate, to mediate disputes, to approve new members and new bosses, and to sanction the most sensitive of actions, including the murder of a high-ranking member. For decades, its very existence was the stuff of legend and rumor. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had for years publicly denied the existence of a national crime syndicate. The Commission was a phantom, a ghost in the machine of organized crime, insulating the men at the very top from the dirty work done on the streets below. The men who sat on this council in the early 1980s were living legends of the underworld. At the head of the table sat Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambinos. He had inherited the family from his cousin, the legendary Carlo Gambino, and he ran it like a Fortune 500 company. He operated from a sprawling 17-room mansion on Staten Island's exclusive Tote Hill, a compound he called the White House. He disdained the blue-collar rackets of gambling and loan sharking, focusing instead on sophisticated white-collar schemes involving construction, trucking, and the meat industry. He famously forbade his men from dealing in narcotics, not out of any moral objection, but because he feared the long prison sentences and the intense law enforcement scrutiny that came with it. This rule was widely and profitably ignored, particularly by John Gotti's crew. Castellano was aloof, insulated, and increasingly out of touch with the street soldiers who generated the family's wealth. Then there was the Genovese family, often called the Ivy League of the mob for their discipline, cunning, and deep penetration into legitimate industries. The man the FBI believed was their boss was Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. He was the quintessential old-school mafioso, overweight, perpetually chomping on a cigar, and holding court from a wicker chair outside the Palma Boys social club in East Harlem. He was gruff, he was powerful, and he was a decoy. The true power, the real boss of the Genovese family, was a man of almost mythical cunning, Vincent the Chin Gigante. For decades, Gigante cultivated an elaborate performance of insanity. He would wander the streets of his Greenwich Village neighborhood in a tattered bathrobe and slippers, muttering incoherently to himself, his family claiming he suffered from schizophrenia. It was a brilliant, long-running act of psychological warfare against the government, designed to render him mentally unfit to ever stand trial. While Gigante played the odd father, the FBI focused its attention on Salerno, the man who sat on the throne as a public target. The Lucchese family was represented by its boss, Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo. He was a quiet, cerebral power broker, a septuagenarian with a reputation for shrewdness and discretion. He earned his nickname for his skill at ducking subpoenas and convictions throughout his long career. Corallo's preferred office was the back seat of his gleaming black Jaguar, chauffeured around the city by his loyal driver, Salvatore Avellino. He believed the constantly moving car was a secure fortress, a place where he could speak freely with his top lieutenants without fear of government eavesdropping. It was a fatal miscalculation. Rounding out the Commission's New York leadership was Carmen "the Snake" Persico, the boss of the Colombo family. The Colombos were the smallest and arguably the most volatile of the five families, with a long history of bloody internal wars. Persico was a product of that violence, a hardened, ruthless figure who had fought his way to the top. He was a man who trusted no one, known for his violent temper, his deep-seated paranoia, and his unyielding grip on his troubled family. He was also possessed of a staggering narcissism, a character flaw that would have dramatic consequences down the line. These men, and others like them, controlled a vast criminal enterprise. Their crown jewel was their chokehold on New York's construction industry, through their complete control of key unions, like the District Council of Cement and Concrete Workers. The Mafia dictated who got to build in New York, and, more importantly, how much they would pay for the privilege. They established the Concrete Club, a cartel of 7 companies, all blessed by the 5 families, that were given exclusive rights to bid on all major construction projects, valued at over $2 million. For any skyscraper to rise in Manhattan, a 2% tax, a mob tax, had to be paid on the value of the concrete contract directly to the Commission. This scheme alone funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into their coffers, money that was the lifeblood of their empire. It was extortion on a corporate scale, a crime so vast and systemic that it was simply factored in as a non-negotiable cost of doing business in New York City. Against this backdrop of immense, institutionalized power stood a man who saw the futility of the government's traditional approach. Rudolph Giuliani was appointed the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York in 1983. He was young, intensely ambitious, and had a flair for the dramatic. Having served in high-ranking roles at the Reagan Justice Department, he arrived with a clear mandate and a revolutionary idea. For decades, law enforcement had been fighting a war of attrition against the mob. They would arrest a soldier for loan sharking, a capo for extortion, and occasionally, with great effort, they would convict a boss. But it never worked. The moment one man was removed, another seamlessly took his place. The organization itself, the structure, remained untouched. It was, in Giuliani's view, like cutting off the tentacle of an octopus. It was painful for the creature, but ultimately it would simply grow back. Giuliani wanted to go for the head, all of them, at once. He didn't want to prosecute individual crimes. He wanted to prosecute the entire criminal enterprise. He wanted to put the Commission itself on trial. It was a strategy so audacious that many in law enforcement considered it impossible, a prosecutor's fantasy. The bosses were masters of insulation. They never touched the drugs, never held the gun, never collected the cash from a terrified shop owner. They gave veiled orders, spoke in code, and relied on a rigid hierarchy of underbosses, consiglieres, and capos to carry out their will. How could you prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a man sitting in a social club in East Harlem was responsible for a murder committed by someone 3 rungs below him on the corporate ladder, a man he had likely never even met? The answer lay in a law that had been on the books since 1970, a piece of legislation that was as complex as it was powerful, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. The RICO Act was a legal paradigm shift. Conceived by a brilliant legal scholar named G. Robert Blakey, it was passed as part of the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970, and it was designed specifically to combat the insulated nature of organized crime leadership. Before RICO, a prosecutor had to prove a defendant's direct involvement in a specific crime. If a mob boss ordered a hit, but the order was passed down through 3 intermediaries, it was nearly impossible to connect the man at the top to the triggerman at the bottom. The chain of command was a shield. RICO shattered that shield. The law allowed prosecutors to target the organization, the enterprise itself. Under RICO, it became a federal crime to belong to a criminal enterprise and to participate in its affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity. A pattern was defined simply as committing 2 or more predicate acts, from a long list that included everything from extortion and bribery to gambling and murder within a 10-year period. The genius of the law was that the crimes didn't have to be related in the traditional sense. A loan sharking operation in the Bronx and the extortion of a construction company in Manhattan could be linked together under one RICO prosecution if it could be proven that both acts were committed in furtherance of the same criminal enterprise, in this case, a specific crime family. Suddenly, prosecutors didn't need to prove that Fat Tony Salerno personally ordered a specific murder. They only needed to prove 2 things. First, that the Genovese crime family existed as a criminal enterprise, and second, that Salerno was its boss, and that he participated, directly or indirectly, in its pattern of illegal activities. The law allowed prosecutors to weave a narrative, to present to a jury a tapestry of seemingly disparate crimes, and show them that they were all part of a single overarching conspiracy. It turned the mob's greatest strength, its hierarchical structure, into its greatest vulnerability. Every crime committed by a soldier for the benefit of the family could now be laid at the feet of the boss. Giuliani and his hand-picked team of young, aggressive prosecutors, including Michael Chertoff and John Savarese, embraced the RICO Act with an almost religious zeal. They recognized it as the tool that could finally make the impossible possible. Their strategy was 2-pronged. First, they had to prove the very existence of the Commission, this mythical board of directors that the Mafia had long denied. Second, they had to prove that the men they were targeting were its members, and that they had used their positions to direct the vast criminal conspiracy of the 5 families. To do this, they would need more than just courtroom theory. They would need evidence. They would need to get inside the mob's most secret sanctums. They would need to make the walls talk. The FBI's war on the Commission began not with informants or raids, but with microphones. In the early 1980s, federal agents embarked on one of the most ambitious and successful electronic surveillance campaigns in history. They were patient, methodical, and incredibly creative, targeting the places where the mob bosses felt most secure. Their successes were the stuff of espionage novels. The most significant breakthrough came from the bugging of Anthony Corallo's Jaguar. After months of surveillance, FBI technicians with the elite C-10 squad managed to gain access to the vehicle. They drilled a tiny hole through the car's frame into the dashboard and planted a sophisticated microphone connected to a transmitter in the trunk. For months, the FBI listened as Corallo and his driver, Salvatore Avellino, drove around New York, discussing the day-to-day business of organized crime. On these tapes, Corallo spoke with startling candor. He provided a masterclass on the operation of the commission. He could be heard saying, "We are the board of directors. All bosses, all underbosses." He detailed the mechanics of the concrete club, explaining how the families divided the lucrative contracts. He complained about other bosses, particularly Paul Castellano, whom he felt was greedy. He essentially provided a guided tour of his criminal world, complete with names, dates, and financial figures. He was, unknowingly, the government's star witness against himself. Another crucial bug was planted in the home of Paul Castellano. For years, agents tried to penetrate the Gambino boss's fortress on Tote Hill. They finally succeeded by using a confidential informant who was dating Castellano's housekeeper. This informant helped agents get inside the house to plant a microphone inside a lamp that sat on the kitchen table. Castellano, the corporate boss, held court from his home, and the FBI was listening to it all. They heard him discussing the division of spoils from various rackets, confirming his position as the head of the Gambino family and a key member of the commission. The tapes captured his frustration with the blue-collar, Gumba's faction of his family, particularly the crew led by John Gotti, whom Castellano viewed as a dangerous loose cannon. The bug revealed the internal fissures that were cracking the family's foundation. Perhaps the most damaging tapes of all came from the home of Angelo "Quack Quack" Ruggiero, a key soldier in John Gotti's crew. The FBI had bugged his home and his telephone, and Ruggiero, a man known for his incessant talking, provided a treasure trove of evidence. He spoke openly and carelessly about the family's massive narcotics operation, a direct violation of Castellano's orders. He complained bitterly about Castellano's leadership and boasted of the power and ambition of his own boss, Gotti. When Castellano learned that Ruggiero was being investigated for drugs and that his conversations had been captured on tape, he was furious. He demanded Ruggiero turn the government tapes over to him, a request that was essentially a death sentence. Ruggiero and Gotti knew that if Castellano heard what was on those tapes, the proof of their drug dealing and their insubordination, they would both be killed. This confrontation, born from an FBI bug, directly set the stage for Castellano's eventual assassination. The government's microphone had not only gathered evidence, it had lit a fuse. But tapes alone were not enough. They were often grainy, and the conversations were filled with mob jargon and coded language that could be difficult for a jury to decipher. Giuliani's team needed a translator, a guide who could walk the jury through the secret world of La Cosa Nostra. They needed a high-ranking member to break the sacred code of silence. Omerta. For decades, this was the mob's ultimate defense. But the culture was changing, and the government was getting better at exploiting the cracks. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Cleveland. Angelo Big Ange Leonardo was the underboss and former acting boss of the Cleveland crime family. He was a mafioso of the old school, born into the life, respected and feared. But in 1983, he was convicted on drug trafficking charges and was facing a life sentence plus 103 years. At 72 years old, it was a death sentence. Faced with the prospect of dying in a federal prison, Leonardo did the unthinkable. He decided to talk. He was the highest-ranking mobster ever to become a federal witness. Leonardo was a walking encyclopedia of organized crime. He knew the history, the rules, and the players. Crucially, He had attended commission meetings. He could testify firsthand about its existence, its membership, and its purpose. He told the FBI how the commission had sanctioned the murder of Philadelphia boss Angelo Bruno, and how it had approved the new leadership in that city. He explained how the commission mediated a dispute between his Cleveland family and the Genovese family over a union in Las Vegas. His testimony was gold. He could identify the voices on the tapes. He could explain to the jury that when men on a wiretap spoke of the board of directors or the club, they were talking about the commission. He could corroborate the FBI's theory of the case from the inside. His cooperation sent a shockwave through the underworld. If a man like Angelo Leonardo could flip, then no one was safe. Armed with a mountain of surveillance recordings and a star witness who could translate them, the federal government was finally ready to strike. On February 25, 1985, U.S. Attorney Giuliani held a press conference to announce the unsealing of a monumental indictment. The charges were staggering. The indictment named 11 defendants, including the bosses or acting bosses of the Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Gambino families, charging them with being members of a ruling criminal commission. The predicate acts listed were a catalog of the mob's greatest hits: extortion, labor racketeering, and ordering multiple murders, including the killing of Bonanno family Capo Carmen, the cigar Galante. The indictment was a declaration of war. It formally accused these men not just of being criminals, but of being the executive leadership of a nationwide criminal conspiracy. The press conference was pure Giuliani theater. He stood before the cameras and declared the government's intention to wipe out the 5 families. It was bold, it was arrogant, and it put immense pressure on his office to deliver a conviction. As the legal teams prepared for what was being billed as the trial of the century, the underworld was thrown into chaos. The indictment had created a crisis, but it was the events of 10 months later that would irrevocably alter the landscape. On that cold December evening outside Sparks Steakhouse, the government's case was both complicated and simplified. Their primary target, Paul Castellano, the man whose conversations from his kitchen formed a cornerstone of their case, was now dead. The brazen assassination, carried out by John Gotti's loyalists, without commission approval, was a flagrant violation of the mob's own cardinal rules. It was an act of rebellion that demonstrated both the commission's weakening authority and the ruthlessness of the new generation. Gotti's coup meant that the Gambino family would not be formally represented by its boss at the trial's outset, but it didn't derail the prosecution's central thesis. The case was about the commission as an institution, and the institution had existed with Castellano as a key member during the period covered by the indictment. The murder simply added a layer of bloody, real-world drama to the courtroom proceedings. It was a stark reminder to the jury of exactly what was at stake, of the lethal violence that underpinned the defendant's power. The trial began on September 8, 1986, at the federal courthouse in Foley Square in Lower Manhattan. The security was unprecedented, involving armed marshals and metal detectors, creating a fortress-like atmosphere. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chertoff, a brilliant and notoriously meticulous lawyer, faced a lineup of the most experienced and expensive defense attorneys in the country. But one defendant chose a different path. Carmen Persico, the boss of the Colombo family, stunned the court by invoking his right to represent himself. It was a move of pure hubris. Persico, a man with only a grade school education, believed his street smarts and force of personality could outwit the government's Ivy League-trained prosecutors. His presence, acting as his own counsel, was a constant, living embodiment of the criminal enterprise the government sought to prove. He was not an abstract defendant accused of crimes. He was the boss, in the flesh, performing for the jury day after day. It was a gift to the prosecution. The government's case was a slow, methodical construction, a legal anaconda that gradually squeezed the life out of the defense. Chertoff's opening statement laid out the roadmap for the jury. He told them they would hear a story of a secret criminal government, a commission that has the power of life and death. He promised to prove its existence, not with one piece of evidence, but with a mosaic of tapes, documents, and testimony from inside the organization itself. The prosecution began by calling a series of witnesses who could establish the very concept of La Cosa Nostra. They brought in FBI agents who had spent their careers studying the mob, historians and low-level informants. They meticulously explained the structure of the families, the initiation rites involving a gun and a holy picture, the blood oaths, and the absolute code of silence. They were teaching the jury a secret language, providing them with a framework to understand the explosive evidence that was to come. Then came the centerpiece of their case, the tapes. For weeks, the jury listened to the secret lives of the defendants. They were transported into the back seat of Tony Corallo's Jaguar. They heard him and his driver, Sal Avellino, casually discussing which construction companies would be allowed to work in New York. "We're the union," Corallo was heard saying. "We control everything." They heard him confirming the existence of the Concrete Club and the 2% tax. The jury was hearing, for the first time in history, the Board of Directors of Murder, Incorporated, conducting their business. The conversations were shockingly mundane. These men weren't cartoon villains. They sounded like disgruntled middle managers, complaining about their colleagues, and arguing over profit sharing. It was this banality that made it so chillingly real. The prosecution would play a tape, and then call an expert witness or an informant to the stand to explain what it meant. They meticulously connected the dots. A vague reference to "our friend" would be explained as the induction of a new-made member. A discussion about a sit-down would be decoded as a formal meeting to resolve a criminal dispute. To prove the Concrete Club extortion, they brought in executives from the construction companies who had been forced to pay the tax. They presented financial records showing the flow of money. They built the case brick by brick, leaving no room for doubt. The star witness, Angelo Lonardo, took the stand and delivered a masterful performance. He was calm, credible, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the mob's inner workings. Speaking in a quiet, deliberate voice, he testified that he had personally attended a commission meeting where the bosses discussed a dispute with his own Cleveland family. He looked at the defendant's table and, one by one, identified the men he knew to be the bosses of the New York families. He pointed out Salerno, Corallo, and Persico. His testimony was devastating. It was the insider confirmation the prosecution needed, the voice of experience that lent credence to all the electronic chatter. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, attempting to portray him as a ruthless killer who was lying to save his own skin. But Lonardo remained unflappable, calmly admitting to his past crimes while sticking to his testimony about the commission. The defense attorneys did their best to chip away at the government's mountain of evidence. They attacked the credibility of the informants. They argued that the tapes were just old men boasting. The defense for Fat Tony Salerno presented a particularly audacious argument. They claimed that while Salerno may have been a high-ranking mobster, he was not, in fact, the boss of the Genovese family. They hinted that the real power lay elsewhere, with the supposedly mentally ill Vincent Gigante. It was a strange defense, essentially arguing that their client was guilty of being a powerful gangster, just not the most powerful one. Carmen Persico's self-representation provided some of the trial's most surreal moments. He cross-examined Angelo Leonardo, a man he had known for years in the underworld. The exchange was a bizarre spectacle of gangster-turned-lawyer confronting gangster-turned-informant. Persico's questions were often rambling and personal, and he frequently drew objections from the prosecution and admonishments from the judge. He succeeded only in demonstrating his arrogance and his utter contempt for the legal system he was now a part of. He was a gangster playing a lawyer, and he was not convincing. After a trial that lasted more than 2 months, the case went to the jury. The jurors had been presented with a secret history of American crime, a detailed blueprint of the Mafia's power structure. They had listened to the defendant's own words, plotting crimes and dividing profits. They had heard from a former boss who had broken the code and explained the rules of their secret society. The deliberation was surprisingly swift for such a complex case, taking less than a week. On November 19, 1986, the jury returned its verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. The 8 defendants, 3 had been severed from the case earlier, and their families sat stone-faced. The clerk read the verdicts, a long, repetitive sequence of guilt. Anthony Corallo, guilty on all counts. Salvatore Santoro, guilty. Christopher Fernari, guilty. Carmen Persico, guilty. Gennaro Langella, guilty. Ralph Scopo, guilty. Anthony Salerno, guilty. The litany of guilt echoed through the room. It was a clean sweep. The government had won on every single charge against every single defendant. The impossible had been achieved. The commission had been brought to justice. The sentencing, which came 2 months later, in January 1987, was the final nail in the coffin. Judge Richard Owen, citing the immense damage the defendants had inflicted on society for decades, handed down sentences that were effectively a death penalty for the elderly mob bosses. Fat Tony Salerno, Tony Dux Corallo, and Carmen Persico were each sentenced to 100 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The others received similarly lengthy terms, with Ralph Scopo, the corrupt union boss, receiving a 100-year sentence as well. Judge Owen told them, "These defendants have shown a blatant disregard for the norms and laws of a civilized society, a society which they have plagued for years." As they were led out of the courtroom, these men who had once been titans, who had held the power of life and death over others, were now just old, defeated criminals, destined to die behind bars. The impact of the commission trial cannot be overstated. It was a watershed moment in the history of law enforcement. It fundamentally altered the balance of power in the fight against the Mafia. The verdict didn't destroy organized crime in America, but it shattered its national leadership structure. The commission, as it had existed for over half a century, was broken. The old guard was gone, replaced by a power vacuum that led to years of internal strife and chaos within the families. John Gotti, who had watched the trial from the sidelines, would soon face his own RICO indictment, and the lessons learned by the government in the commission case would be instrumental in finally convicting the Teflon Don in 1992. The trial vindicated Rudy Giuliani's audacious strategy and cemented the RICO Act as the single most effective weapon against complex criminal organizations. It became the blueprint for prosecutions against not just the mob, but also corrupt corporations, political machines, and international cartels. The anatomy of this takedown was not rooted in violence or informants alone, but in legal theory. It was the successful application of an idea that you could prosecute an organization's structure, that you could hold the men at the very top accountable for the institutional sins of the entire enterprise. It was about proving that the whole was far more dangerous than the sum of its criminal parts. The commission trial proved that no one was untouchable. It demonstrated that even the most shadowy, insulated, and powerful criminal conspiracies could be dragged into the light of a courtroom and dismantled, piece by methodical piece. The ghosts that had haunted the American legal system for 50 years had finally been captured, their power exorcised not by a silver bullet, but by the patient, relentless application of the law. The verdict was more than just a conviction. It was the end of an empire. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.